Hello, I'm Dr. Marty Matlock. Today I'd like to discuss risks from underground storage tanks. A little bit about me. I'm a professor of biological and ag engineering at the University of Arkansas. I am the executive director of our University of Arkansas Resiliency Center. I'm not being compensated in any way for providing this summary. This is what we do. We work with water and communities and try to help communities understand and mitigate risk and increase the resiliency of their systems. So a person who I don't know reached out to me through a mutual contact and asked me if I'd be willing to do this, and I certainly am happy to do so. But I don't have any interest, financial or otherwise, in the discussions or the outcomes of the decisions in this process. Underground storage tanks are critical for modern society. Liquid fuels we burn, gasoline, diesel fuel, heating, oil, kerosene, etc., are stored in underground storage tanks all across the landscape. The reason we put them underground is because that protects them from accidental puncture, from impact, from fire, from lightning strikes, other catastrophic failures, or even intentional damage. So we have over 500,000 underground storage tanks in place nationwide currently. The problem with underground storage tanks is that they're underground, and like all tanks, they leak eventually. And when they leak, because they're underground, we often do not notice. And in fact, this was a crisis in the 1980s because we had all of these legacy underground storage tanks, some of them going back to the 1930s, 50 years, and they were leaking at almost every intersection of every highway you could find. You could dig down 10 feet and find gasoline product either in the soil or in the groundwater. So we had this massive contamination event. So leaky underground storage tanks, when they leak, they result in contamination of the soil above the water table as well as the groundwater below the tanks. And so you get this sort of smear of material of whatever the product is, gasoline, diesel, whatever it is, across that environment, that subsurface environment. Federal underground storage tank regulations evolved very quickly as a result of that big economic and environmental challenge. So now we have release detection methods or leak detection methods to detect certain leak rates consistently. We also have double containment systems. So there are a number of regulations in place for modern underground storage tanks that make them much, much safer than they have been before. But the thing is, they're still tanks, and they still leak. So methods must detect according to the EPA federal rules, methods must detect the specified leak rate with a probability of detection of at least 95%, which is very high, and a probability of a false alarm of no more than 5%. Detection performance standards of detecting a leak of 0.2 gallons per hour with a probability of detection of at least 95% and a probability of false alarm of no more than 5%. A bit redundant, but you get the point. What this means is that EPA allows leak detection failure rates of up to 5% before the system has to be further modified. And that can be a problem because we have a lot of storage tanks, especially in the Chicago area. The density on a per county basis is generally greater than 650 underground storage tanks per county. What that means is if you're in a high density county, well, the probability of an underground storage tank leak is very low, no more than 5%. The density of these tanks is so high that you could have as many as 30 leak events going undetected at any given time. 30 leak events at any given time. Thus, when contamination is detected in groundwater, it's not just the problem of the detection. When you find a contamination event, how do you figure out where it came from? That becomes also problematic. Now, why does that matter? Why do you have to look back in time and upstream to figure out where things came from? Because that goes to the liability of who has to clean it up. And if you can't figure out where it came from with any confidence, it's going to be hard to dig into somebody's pockets to make them clean it up. So this sort of liability tracing is expensive, time-consuming, and frankly uncertain. So that's one of the other challenges with these underground storage tanks. There are a number of state programs that have been in place for almost 40 years now for remediating underground storage tanks, but many of them are frankly broke, those programs. They don't have any more money in them. So the certainty across the landscape of whether a leaky underground storage tank today, if detected, could be cleaned up is open. It just depends on where you are and when you are. So let's talk about us, the human factor. Environmental risk or human risk is the product of hazard and exposure. Risk, the risk to a human for a toxin, is the hazard, the toxin, times the exposure. Petrochemical fuels are very toxic. They are high hazards. Exposure must be very low in order for the risk to be acceptable. Exposure occurs through leaks of these underground storage tanks where fuel enters either the soil or groundwater. So when a tank leaks, as you can see from this figure, when a tank leaks, you have both vapor going up into residential areas and product, we call gasoline, diesel fuel, etc., product, going down. And this product going down goes down until it hits groundwater, then it spreads out. And it spreads out with the groundwater. It just says groundwater flows towards the ocean. Actually, this is from a reporter at the Orlando or the Orange County Register, but it actually flows down an energy gradient. In Florida, she's right. This does flow down to the ocean. For the rest of us, it flows down an energy gradient, usually to a well, which is causing the energy gradient, or a river or stream, where the groundwater is leaving entering the surface water system. So that means that when a leak occurs, the impact is broad spread. It can be miles and miles, depending on how big the leak is, how long it goes undetected, and what kind of environment you have, what the geology of the site is. In places that have high limestone concentration or karst geology, a plume of contaminated water or of leaking gasoline can move for miles in a week. That's an exaggeration, perhaps, but sometimes our groundwater moves very fast, depending on the rainfall that's driving it, depending on other gradients. Certainly, meters per day is a reasonable movement through porous media like sandstone, gravel, limestone. In clay and other densely packed soils, it may not move at all because the material is so densely packed that there's no space for the material to move through. So that's one of the concerns, is that you can't just put every underground storage tank in the same way because your risks are different to the impacts of leaking based upon where you put them and based upon what's around you. Now, we typically site these underground storage tanks that is gasoline stations or petrochemical refueling stations. We typically site them in commercial areas because that way, if you do have a leak, the people who are exposed to it are exposed for a very short period of time. When you site these close to residential areas, the problem is if you do have a leak, and I think it's safe to say when you do have a leak, that those vapors and those plumes can go up into houses, or into buildings like houses where people are occupying them sometimes 16 hours a day, sometimes 24 hours a day, especially with COVID. And so you have people in this house 24 hours a day breathing the vapors coming up from the soil, and that exposure just went way up. And that means the hazard and times exposure means the risk went way up. And that's the challenge you have with these systems, is they create dramatically enhanced risk when they're located near residential areas. We reconcile that risk often by not locating these near residential areas. We locate these refueling stations near commercial areas where people maybe are in a building for 8 or 10 hours a day, but often in and out. Rarely is it. And so you wouldn't even put these near big office complexes. Generally, they're near retail areas with lots of short-term traffic. Because gasoline, for example, has benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene as predominant compounds, among other things. There's a lot of stuff in gasoline, but those three things, BTEX or BTEX as they're often called, are the dominant chemical indicators of gasoline. Benzene is of course, a known human carcinogen. It causes acute myelocytic leukemia and bone marrow depression. It's a nasty chemical. Inhalation of benzene may also occur through a process called vapor intrusion. That's what we're discussing with houses, where benzene and other volatile organic compounds move, like toluene, xylene, and ethylbenzene, move through the soil into the buildings and then contaminate indoor air. Toluene, xylene, and ethylbenzene that are released from these leaky underground storage tanks have been linked to tiredness, confusion, weakness, drunk-type interactions, memory loss, nausea, loss of appetite, hearing loss, color vision loss, irritation of the skin, nose, eyes, throat, difficulty breathing, problems with lungs and kidneys. They're organic solvents. They do what organic solvents do. We are organic. They dissolve us. That's not good for us. It's not good for other living things. The IARC has classified ethylbenzene as a possible human carcinogen. So these are nasty chemicals. Then we have MTBE, which is the chemical that's added to gasoline, especially unleaded gasoline, to boost octane so that your engine doesn't knock. It's incredibly water soluble. So when you have a leak, the MTBE moves into the water, leaving the other stuff that is less soluble in behind, and just moves as fast as the water moves. So it's a very complex thing when these leaks occur, and the risks associated with them are very complex, but they certainly exist. All federally regulated underground storage tanks have leak detection methods or combinations of methods that can detect a release from any portion of the tank and connecting underground pipes and products routinely. This technology has advanced dramatically in the last 20 years. So there is no, I am not trying to imply in any way that there's any incompetency associated with the process of putting in underground storage tanks. But there are risks, and there are consequences to those risks. Let's talk about risk. If I assume a risk, if I smoke a cigar and drink a scotch, I knowingly expose my body to contaminants that could harm me. If I drive fast in the rain, I knowingly put myself and others at risk. Those are assumed risks. I am responsible for the consequences of my risk. Now, imposed risks are risks that I don't have any say over, that someone else's actions cause potential harm to me, impose risks to me. They create risk for me. So these are risks that we do not take personally, but rather that are imposed on us, knowingly or not. So these include pollution impacts, building integrity. We assume our buildings are safe until they fall down. Bridge safety. We assume our bridges are safe until they fall down, and so forth. So it's generally deemed unethical and in many cases illegal to impose risk on others without their permission. So those are the especially localized risks that are not distributed. We do this all the time with where we put polluting industries that emit a lot of toxic chemicals, even in low concentrations. The fact that they're emitting them constantly and that people around them are exposed constantly results in high risk. And then there's another consideration altogether. Modern leak detection systems that incorporate a set of sensors and detect fuel products that escape from the storage tank, like you saw on the previous slide, are incredibly sophisticated, but they're based on the chemical characteristics of the fuel. Battelle National Laboratories did a study for EPA evaluating the effectiveness of those technologies with ethanol blended fuel, with biofuels. The problem with ethanol blended fuel is you put 10% ethanol in almost all fuels and up to 30% ethanol in ethanol blended fuels. You change the characteristics of the material. And when you change the characteristics of the material, those characteristics may alter the ability to detect a leak. And in fact, this Battelle report, which was 2015, released 6 years ago, but it's relatively contemporary, found that if you look at different types of detection methods, of leak detection categories and technologies, if you look at liquid out-of-tank methods, that high ethanol, 51 to 83% ethanol technologies, that hydrocarbon layer and fuel sensitive polymers don't work for that detection system. And water floats and density floats and conductivity probes don't work. And these are common probes that are used in these leak detection systems. EPA typically doesn't dictate what technology you use, only that you use a technology that meets its detection criteria, and that's usually determined by other testing means. But when you change the fuel, like we have done, what does that do to the leak detection systems? Now, it's very likely that regulations have caught up with the technology. I'm not asserting that because, frankly, we've been in an anti-regulatory cycle for at least 4 years, and so it's possible that nothing's changed. This is a risk consideration that we should take very seriously, because these ethanol blended fuels could leak without detection, and they will move faster because they're water soluble, more water soluble than non-ethanol blended fuels. These are big considerations for our safety and welfare of our communities. Because remember, it's not just the leak that's the problem, it's what's around the leak, what's above the leak. And so a leak in a commercial zone will require cleanup, but rarely does it have a big consequence to the environment or to people in a commercial district. But in a residential district, it can be dramatic. The other thing that can happen, by the way, is especially in rural areas where rural pipes use polybutyl ethylene, PBE, these black plastic pipes, that gasoline, that product, that benzene solubilizes through that and can actually, so if the groundwater is contaminated with benzene, and this water distribution pipe, which is some parts probably 3-4 feet below ground, and so you happen to have a high water table because of rainfalls, etc., or just the geology of the location, you can actually have benzene soaking that water pipe, and that could expose the people that could eventually leach into and then leach back into the drinking water moving through that pipe, which could expose people to ingestion of benzene, a carcinogen. So, will underground storage tanks in the proposed neighborhood increase imposed risk? Almost certainly. Is that a huge risk or a small risk? I don't know. That would require a significant risk assessment study. But certainly the risk increases because it's not there now and it will be there later if approved, and that increases the risk. All tanks leak eventually. The high density of tanks in a region combined with the detection rate lead to a potential that many tanks in a region are leaking. And so even if you detect off-site contamination in groundwater with a monitoring well, finding out where it came from becomes very difficult. That's why keeping these out of neighborhoods is so important. Any increase in tanks will increase the risk. Now, the uncertainty about leak detection effectiveness with new biofuels mixture may increase the potential for undetected leaks. So who benefits? This is another moral question, is the benefit versus the cost. Who benefits in these systems? Underground storage tanks benefit the petroleum retail supply chain directly, obviously, and consumers because you can get access to fuel, and putting them underground lowers catastrophic failure potential. So there are distributed benefits to the population, obviously, but also really who benefits are the people who own the gas stations and the fuel franchises. Who pays? Well, the environmental risks are borne by the residents within the soil vapor and groundwater plumes when the leaks occur. This has been a fairly brief overview of the processes of risk associated with underground storage tanks. I hope it's been helpful.